Dr. Jordan Seng, pastor, serial entrepreneur, author, restaurateur.
You make me sound unfocused.
But where are we now? Where are we now?
This is the lovely facility of Bluewater Mission, my church in the hills above Aina Haina. We've been in this building about almost 2 years now.
2 years.
Yeah, we were in the heart of Honolulu in Kali'i at Palama Settlement for about 10 years, and then we lost that during the COVID shutdowns. And took refuge here, and it's worked out really nicely for us.
Nice. So you've been here for a couple of years. Is this what you always found yourself wanting to do? How did you become a pastor?
I became a pastor by accident. I guess I had set out to pursue an academic career. I had studied at Stanford, University of Chicago. I did a postdoc at Harvard, all the prestigious programs, got some prestigious fellowships and stuff like that. And
that's an unusual path for a pastor.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me.
Yeah, there was certainly no seminary involved or anything like that. But all along the way, I was a Christian. I was a person of faith. I was ministering. And I kept accidentally planting churches. When I was an undergrad at Stanford, I got involved with a church plant. It was about maybe 30, 35 people when I got involved. And then by the time I graduated, there were 600 and some odd people in the church. And that was kind of an early church plant experience of mine. I got to help lead that. And then in grad school, the University of Chicago was a very tough South Side neighborhood. And I just really couldn't find a decent living church there. So my young wife and I, Sonia, started it's just a small fellowship gathering, prayer meeting, Bible study in the living room of our loft apartment. And it just grew and grew and grew, and then that became a church. And 25 years later, that church is still there and doing great, being pastored by some really faithful people. And then did my postdoc at Harvard and Cambridge and Boston, got involved with the church plant there with some friends who were from Stanford. Same deal, we got involved about the time it started Sunday meetings, and that grew and grew and grew, and that church is still going. I did not plan to plant Bluewater Mission in Honolulu, but events conspired 14 or 15 years ago now. Along the way, my other vocational plans, my academic plans, they kind of washed out. In some ways, I was really successful in what I did academically, scholastically.
What was your focus?
I was an international policy analyst. My specialty was in security matters, weapons of mass destruction, and deterrence, and stuff like that.
Oh, a clear connector to
yeah.
eventually becoming a pastor.
Yeah, well, strategic studies. And I enjoyed it. I think I did well at it. Was a part of some top-notch programs, won some fellowship, published articles in the leading academic journals in the field. And one day, my dissertation advisor, one of them pulled me aside and said, "Look, you're a smart kid, and I really like your work. I think you've hit on something, you're right on. But you are a white man, and your conclusions will be politically unpopular. You'll never get a job in this field. Do something else."
And what year was this?
That was in 1998.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And I didn't want to believe him, so I stuck with it for a few more years. But I spent 4 years on the job market. And I was publishing. I would occasionally lecture to policymakers in Washington, D.C. I mean, the stuff was good stuff that I'd come to.
Sure.
But in that time, it's not just that I didn't get a job at a university. Not a single university in America would even interview me.
And that you felt was because?
I just don't think my stuff was very fashionable. I wasn't very fashionable. Academia is a little bit faddish. I think it's worse today than it was back then. It's far, far worse. But yeah, it just didn't work out.
Is this something where, as you're planting these churches, as you say, which is essentially you, it sounds like you having these small groups of people into homes, and then that becomes something bigger where it needs a larger space, right? That's essentially what you're saying. Doing that sort of by night, and then your day job is kind of academia.
That's exactly it, yeah.
What was did you feel like you had to be two different people because of what you're saying the conflict was, and culturally between the two spaces? Or did you force yourself to bring what you were doing in these church plants into academia? Or how did you manage to reconcile those things?
So for me personally, I felt like there was a lot of complementarity. I mean, I really enjoyed it. The one thing I carry away from all of my years in the higher academy is I feel like I got a really muscular brain. This is a great time to be alive. Learning is so easy in the world these days, right? Information is at your fingertips. I was a political theorist by training, which meant that I was constantly reading history. I was constantly up on current events. And these are things that really matter in how people live. They shape our lives way more than the average person realizes. And then ministry is really about navigating life. And it also is about delving into the deepest truths that you can find. And so I love it. I found them mutually energizing. Now, everybody in the church world, in the ministry world, accepted that I was an academic and that I was, marching in the ivory halls and stuff like that.
That wasn't a problem for them.
That wasn't a problem for them. In the academic world, I found it was scandalous to be a Christian. Scandalous. I published an article once in a international security journal. It's still a leading journal. And I got to know the editor a little bit. And the article was successful, so he asked me to publish a follow-on article in the form of a debate with this sort of eminent professor in America. So it was me versus him in print. So really fun, really fun.
Okay.
I loved it. And
what were you debating?
We were debating policy concerning weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear power and stuff like that. And in the course of the debate, the editor talked to this other professor, whom I had gotten to know a bit, and discovered that I was a Christian. And so one afternoon, I'm sitting at my desk at the University of Chicago, and the editor calls me out of the blue. Says, hello. I didn't even introduce himself. I didn't even say, hey, it's Ben. He just said, is it true? Are you one of them? So what are you talking about, man? He said, you're a Christian? Yeah, I'm a Christian. What of it? That's impossible. I didn't see that coming. They're so rare in the higher academy. In the liberal arts. Now in science, they're all over the place, but in the liberal arts, they're super rare. And it was scandalous, and word ran around, and people would approach me in workshops around the country and be like, you are a Christian?
Right. Wait, why do you think that is, though? Why is it so rare? And it's interesting you said it's not as rare in the sciences, but it's rare in the liberal art. Why the differentiation?
Well, sciences, there are still some hard sciences that are data-driven, right? They're not politicized because either your machine works or it doesn't. Either the biology works or it doesn't.
Right.
And you can measure that. You're not judged on your perspective. You're judged on your results, your data.
Right.
Now, in the softer sciences or the liberal arts, there's a lot of subjectivity. Well, there's not a lot of subjectivity, but there's a lot of wiggle room. There's a lot of space for pretension. And it's a super, super politicized environment. Super politicized. Like you do not find conservative people, moral conservatives or political conservatives at the vast majority of leading universities in America. And
it's gotten more true since the 90s.
In the last 20 years, it's much more severe. And I put it this way, that today, the American universities are like temples. Like the people who run them consider them sacred spaces. And if you disagree with the powers that be, it's not that they debate you, it's not that they call you wrong, it's not that they question your data. They consider you a blasphemer, right? And that's the attitude. Like, we can't even have you on these holy grounds.
Interesting.
It wasn't quite that bad when I was in it, but it was definitely tending in that direction. And the tragedy is that universities have become places where you can't pursue truth freely, right? You have to leave.
What do you mean by truth?
Reality about anything. Pick a question and figure out.
They've already decided, is what you're saying.
Yeah, they've already decided there are certain things that you cannot discover. Even if they exist, you're not allowed to discover them. And I did political policy. I made some predictions about how situations of proliferation, weapons proliferation, would turn out in the world. I picked some hot spots. I wrote a dissertation about it. I made predictions, and I got vastly criticized. So it's been 25 years. Every single one of them have come true.
No way.
Yeah.
Like what?
Well, a little complicated to explain. So there's a long-standing conflict between India and Pakistan.
Right.
Right, and there's a touch point in Kashmir, but they fought more than one war in the post-colonial age, which only started in the late 1940s. And then both India and Pakistan got nuclear weapons. And so in academia, that set off a bunch of alarms, and people thought, well, this is gonna
I kind of remember
up.
these conversations
Yeah,
too.
this is gonna blow up. And so I took a look at their behavior and sort of what I thought the effect of the proliferation of these weapons would be, and I said, actually, they're gonna simmer down. Like, they'll have low-level conflicts, but it will stabilize over time. And I predict, and I had another debate with another eminent scholar who eventually blackballed me from his university, but was like, well, in 25 years' time, will there have been nuclear explosions along the border? And I said, no way. And he said, oh, for sure, even if they're by accident, because they can't control these.
It was undeniable for him. There was no room for any other possibility.
Him and 98% of other people in higher academia.
Interesting.
Because it was politically useful to be alarmist.
Yeah.
Right? And it's always sexier in academia to deconstruct ideas rather than construct ideas. What you want to do is destroy previous thinking.
The critic is far easier to...
Yeah, and criticism is cheap. Creativity is actually harder. But everybody needs to make their mark. And the easiest way to make your mark is to be an alarmist or to be a critic. Anyway.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of academia operates off of money from the universities, grants, and things like this. And so is that kind of what you're getting at? That it's also financially expedient to have popular opinions, whether from the perspective of the people who are handing out the money.
Yeah. It's basically a campaign.
Right.
Rather than an investigation these days.
Right. It's interesting too what you say about the critic, because it's so, in the arts as well, it's very true. It's much easier to tear down what other people are doing and point out all the things that didn't go right. And you're not involved. Your neck's not on the line. You're not producing things. You're not creating and risking the critique yourself, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's true across industries and businesses and things.
Yeah, and when you run out of things to criticize, you have to find new things to criticize, and you find yourself trying to tear down the bedrock of institutions, cultures, and So it's a philosophy that sort of feeds on itself. I've likened it in the past as sort of an addictive mindset.
Right.
And it starts with a little criticism, and then you're trying to throw everything out the window and burn the whole thing down. And what does that leave you with?
Right. The word disruption has been such a popular term when it comes to getting attention in the last 5 to 10 years, right?
Yeah.
Specifically online digital marketing and that sort of things. But it's like, what are you willing to sacrifice in order to disrupt things? And maybe marketing, it isn't as big of a deal as it could be in other institutions, right? In society.
Disruptive marketing.
What are you willing to disrupt? What are you willing to put down or say isn't good just to be new and novel and interesting?
I worry, as a matter of cultural commentary, I worry that because the majority of people now go to college, now go to university, and they get conditioned by this deconstructionist culture. And then they go out into the world, and it conditions their relationships, it conditions their politics, their outlook, the way that they perceive things. And I worry that perhaps collectively we've just lost our ability to recognize wisdom when we hear it.
Because what are we basing the wisdom on?
What are we basing the wisdom on? You've never invented anything. You've never actually built anything.
Right.
But you think you know the answers because your education never taught you to question what was popular.
Right.
It only taught you to question what was old, what was tried and true.
And because you're capable of pointing out the 1 or 2 things that are wrong with the existing system.
It makes you think you're powerful
Right.
to be able to do that.
Well, not to totally destroy colleges, but another topic that's kind of becoming more, getting more traction right now is, what is the value of college now versus what it used to be, right?
Yeah. I saw a great study recently. Oh gosh, I can't remember the author. But it was a longitudinal study of earning potential of graduates from, on the one hand, state colleges, and on the other hand, Ivy League colleges, your Harvards, your Princetons, your Yales. And it turned out that, like, over a 10-year period, the earning potential of degrees from both the Ivy League and the state colleges was identical. There was no advantage to going to Harvard rather than, Idaho State. No advantage in terms of economic well-being through life.
Right. But yet they're more expensive to attend than they've ever been, right?
Yeah.
So you walk out in debt with no earning potential, or not as much as you should have.
It needs to, not to be a constructionist myself, but like the university college system, it needs to collapse.
Here we go, critiquing things ourselves.
It's.
But part of it is too, everybody has. It used to be 20 years ago. Oh, you should go get a computer science degree, for instance, right? Because now everybody has a computer science degree. You know what people aren't doing is learning to work with their hands. What happens in another 10 years when nobody knows how to fix anything?
Your job security as a plumber is way better than your job security as an AI engineer at this point.
Right. Yeah. Or a mechanic, or somebody who can just put things back together. It's so much less common for people to go into that field. So it makes you think, if I want to encourage my children to go to college, if they don't have a specific field that they want to enter, if they're just going to go get a business degree or something, it's...
Yeah, and information and learning is cheap. Like, you can go online and get such a fantastic education.
Right.
You can get into apprenticeship programs or mentorship programs, get such a fantastic education. I'm really thankful that I went through all of higher academia. I did the PhD work. I walked with the brightest minds in America for a long, long time. And the reason I'm thankful for it is because I learned how to learn and how not to learn. And then since I left all of that at age 30, I think I've learned way more than I ever did before age 30.
And what you're specifically referencing is what you just sort of spoke about, which is how to actually learn and grow as opposed to just being a critic.
Yeah. Because and you can recognize people. You can recognize people in academia who actually do the work versus people who are just stylish. And you see the difference. You can see the difference between what it takes to defend a position versus what it takes to actually discover something.
Right.
And more than anything else, I think that's what I studied. I didn't intend to, but that's what I carried away. It takes a lot to be an author in life.
Right.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
A lot to be an author. Anybody can write stuff.
Right.
But it takes a lot to be an author. Anybody can get a degree, but a truly educated human, incredibly rare. Incredibly rare.
Right. Yeah, I found that I discovered the same thing after I went to film school. I spent so much of my time writing and directing in film school.
Yeah.
And then I graduated and I realized I didn't even have a marketable skill because nobody's going to let me graduate and start
You didn't know how to
directing.
navigate the business. You didn't know how to make a living. Like how do you get to step one?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it took me a number of years just to figure out, okay, what of the skills that I did not focus on during film school can actually produce a living for me, right? What of those do I need to learn so that I can support myself, right?
Yeah.
And then figure out how to do the stuff that I actually want to do, the creative part.
Yeah. And I think what you're talking about reduces to character and personal strength and individualism. Another big movement that we're seeing in America is this crowd mentalities, right? I mean, let's try to give it a really polite name. And I think the actual individual is also a very rare creature. And we're not raising people, we're not teaching people, at least institutionally, we're not teaching people to be actual individuals. We're teaching them to be lockstep marchers, You're not allowed to speak your mind anymore. If you say the wrong thing on YouTube, you're deplatformed within 24 hours.
Ooh,
You know this.
hopefully that doesn't happen to us.
Free investigation is no longer allowed in a lot of venues. But you graduate from college and you have all of this ostensible education, and you still have to invent a life, right? You have to make your own way. And any skill that you learn in college is going to be obsolete 8 years later anyway. So you have to keep learning, right? Like, you have to turn the page a lot these days. And how do you equip somebody for that? And it turns out you can't do it just by pumping their head full of information. You actually have to develop them as a human. You actually have to develop them as a person. What actually makes a person strong? What actually makes a person wise?
Right.
And, well, I'm a Christian minister, so that's my wheelhouse now, and I've been studying that for 40 years, hard, and it turns out that what makes a person, really strong, really wise, really free and inventive, hasn't changed much over the millennia.
Right.
There are a handful of things that you can point to, including, humility. So you touched on something important there.
I mean, I do, as a Christian myself, I do find that I'll see things, whether on social or on a book, a self-help book, and they're getting at some advice for people in the modern world, right?
Right.
And the advice is often accepted or given as if it's this revelation.
The latest thing.
But when it's good, it usually already existed. It's usually something that I recognize from my faith, over the years, or from the Bible, or from going to school at a Lutheran high school. It's like, this is wisdom that's been around for a while.
And it totally makes sense that would be the case.
Right.
You look at things like moral traditions, like real tried and true moral traditions, like Christianity itself. It's been around for a long time in what is a very competitive environment There are lots of different philosophies that bubble up in the world. There are lots of different religions that bubble up in the world.
Right.
There are lots of different cultures that bubble up in the world. And Christianity has excelled in pretty much all of them.
Sure.
It has sort of mastered the competition. And you ask yourself, well, why? There is a natural selection of ideas in the world as well. Stupid ideas tend to get selected out of
Right.
society over generations. I mean, they can exist for a generation or two or three,
Right.
but they tend to die out because they end up killing people, right?
It's evolution, right?
It's the evolution of ideas. And if you have something that exists in its original form, I mean, Christianity is probably unique among world religions in that it continues to be orthodox. It's exactly what it was in the first century to astonishing degree. And all the competition, all the generations, people are finding it really trustworthy. And so if you're just commonsensical, merely commonsensical,
Right.
you would look at it and think, well, maybe there's not even a God, but dang it, that has proven useful across countless generations.
Right.
There must be something important in it.
And some of that same advice, it still makes sense from a secular perspective, or even some of that same advice exists in other religions, right?
Yeah.
And it, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, some of it exists in other religions, that's true, but I think the idea that all religions and worldviews are the same is preposterous. I mean, you take a look at them, they're like fantastic, gross differences between Christianity and Islam and,
Sure.
and Hinduism and stuff like that. So, but some of the values you can find throughout because they're just bread and butter values, right?
Right, they just
Humanity
work.
has found them to work. And secular movements, I think, have found them to work as well. I've read a lot of psychology over the years, not surprisingly, given what I do in ministry. In the 1990s, there was a big move in psychology called positive psychology. And the idea was essentially this. Psychology as a field is not that old, right? It's like, it dates to, maybe
The
the,
early
the
20th
first
century.
half of the 20th century is
Yeah.
really, and then counseling and family counseling and stuff like that was largely an American invention and doesn't exist in a lot of the world, so fairly recent. But in the 1990s, a group of psychologists, led by a couple of famous ones, realized that psychologists had discovered a lot about what makes people sick. Called it abnormal psychology.
Okay.
You would find somebody with a psychological quirk and you figured out how it would happen. But what they hadn't done is figure out what makes people healthy. And so what's normal psychology, or positive psychology, as they called it in the first instance. And then there were a couple of these canonical pioneering studies, and it turned out that what made people healthy were things like forgiveness and grace and loving relationships and the rhythm of hard work. And it's, in other words,
Right.
conventional character morality.
Right.
And the sorts of things that you would hear from any pulpit.
So it's like scientifically, we proved the things that, Christianity and some other faiths in certain perspectives were saying for thousands of years.
Yeah,
Right?
not
And
surprisingly.
we just said, well, science is important now, so let's try to figure out
Yeah.
if this is true. Oh yeah, it's true.
Yeah,
Interesting.
it takes a very smart person to be that ignorant of conventional wisdom
Right. Right.
that you discover it anew for yourself.
Right.
Like, you have to work really hard to do something like
But
that.
this is amazing.
Yeah,
Is it? Or is it just,
And
I
then
mean, I
you
guess
buy
that
it.
it functions in every context is pretty incredible.
yeah.
But we already knew so
We
much.
kind of knew that.
We already knew so much of it.
And there are similar things you can discover in sociology or even education. There's, I mean, I read this stuff a lot, so
Yeah.
I'm gonna say boring things, but like the value of monogamy
Right.
is just revolutionary.
Right.
Revolutionary. And it's not something that was universal in the world by any means, but wherever it took root, prosperity followed. great degree. And then largely through Christianity, actually, it became normative around the world. And wherever it lags, or whether there's a lot of promiscuity, just poverty and destruction follow. It's really easy. And yet, there's a huge movement in our country today against the so-called nuclear family, and traditional modes of child rearing and stuff like that. Senseless stuff, no matter what side of the political or religious arena you come from.
And you just feel like that's a way to be different. That's a way to, I will glean a bit of power, even if it's just within myself, by just saying no to tradition.
Makes you feel powerful, makes you feel like you're cutting edge, makes you feel like you've discovered something new. But really all you're doing is trying to criticize something old. Maybe you found 1 or 2 points to criticize and it makes you think that you know something, but I don't know, it's the same disease, the same intellectual disease that we're seeing.
Right.
And
so you took all of what you learned about, in and through academia, and then you're simultaneously planting churches. And then what happens? Did you just move to start pastoring one of the churches, or?
Yeah, essentially. I eventually walked away from academia, just like this is margin of diminishing returns. I went into business for a while. I became a software executive, and
here we go. Here's all the other avenues.
I had to, teach myself some software and some business acumen. That was a really valuable experience as well. It was part of a startup. I was living in Boston, north of Boston, in Gloucester, and was rehabbing this old fisherman's house. I enjoy that. I grew up around construction with my dad. And the phone rang one day, and I just had the most stark premonition, like this. I think it was God who said to me, "Oh, that's Dan Chun, this pastor in Hawaii. He's calling, and he's going to offer you a job at a church."
Okay.
Take
in Hawaii.
In Hawaii.
Okay.
I had my stepmom is from Hawaii. I married into a Hawaiian family. I spent a lot of my life in the islands, beginning in my childhood. So this was always kind of a home away from home. And I had traveled to Hawaii and spoken at some Christian conferences and done some things in ministry.
So you were kind of a known entity here.
A little kind of a known entity, but I was not at all considering moving to Hawaii. It was just that, I left my career and I was trying to build a new life. And then Dan's experience on the other side of it was equally supernatural and mystical, the way he felt led to call me. But before I picked up the phone, I knew it. And then I picked up the phone and I said, "Hello." I said, "Jordan, it's Dan Chun calling from Hawaii." It was just the most mystical moment. And then he said, "This is going to sound crazy, but blah, blah, blah." I said, "Yeah, okay."
So you felt like something told you that Dan was calling, that Dan Chun was calling you.
Clear as day.
Before you picked up the phone.
Before I picked up the phone. Otherwise, I would never have even considered it.
Okay.
But I felt like the decision was made for me by the time we hit the fourth ring. And it's like, for some reason, I know exactly what's going to happen.
Really?
Yeah. And then my wife came home later that day. And,
So you move. So at this point, it's just you and your wife, Sonia.
Your wife, Sonia, we were pregnant with our first, with Jojo. We were, we were 6 months pregnant or something.
So this is a big decision. This
was a big decision, and we had this house. I was rehabbing, and I really enjoyed it. So it was kind of like, well, do we really start over in a new place? But because I had that word from God, I was like, yep, I guess we're going to do this. And there's just a lot of my life, the shape of my life, that cannot be explained without recourse to supernatural explanations. I can't be shy about that. It's like, this is how it worked. And how has that turned out for you overall? Because I think listening to the supernatural, what you're talking about is you feel like God is speaking to you in these situations, right? That one in particular, other situations in your life. Sure.
What have the results of that been throughout your
Well,
life?
the results have been a very strange and interesting life, right? I think sometimes the reason the Lord has to speak in such moments as I described, because I can't make that change naturally. Like, there's no way I would have gotten there on my own.
Right, you never would have been like,
Never
oh,
would have been. And so he sort of spoke into that moment and said, look, I'm doing something here. You're going to zig instead of zag. Pay attention. And a lot of times when I feel led by the Lord, it feels exactly like that. It feels like he's just saying, I've got something that you need to pay attention to. This is going to happen in the future. Sometimes it's not convenient to know the future, frankly. For instance, you could predict exactly 25 years of military stability in South Asia. And,
it didn't do you any good.
and it just makes people hate you and kick you out of the academy. That could happen.
Right. Now, just to clarify, do you feel like that was from the Lord, or was that a God thing, or was that just?
There was a lot of my work I felt was, spiritually guided, shall we say.
Okay.
But none of it entirely spiritually guided, because I actually had to do the research and read the history and interview people and stuff like that.
So there's a difference for you between kind of experience, hard work, preparation, outcome X, and God speaking outcome.
Well, because I'm a spiritual man all the time, even when I'm investigating something practically, even when I'm learning a software package, even when recently I picked up CAD design, because I love boats, and I'm designing a sailboat. And
there you go again.
And it's this stuff is very refreshing for me. But I'm always the spiritual guy, right? I'm always in conversation with God, and on a good day I feel led. And sometimes he says, "Oh, let's do this," and sometimes he's like, "You need to stop doing this, man. That's stupid." And so when I say life is interesting, that's what I mean. It's like sometimes it's frustrating as all get out, but ends up being fruitful. And in my life, one way I would summarize my life is saying I've achieved a lot and succeeded at little. There are a lot of things that just didn't work out, my academic career being one, that business career in software that had an interesting ending and transition out. And it's another long story. And yet, the failures themselves tend to be productive. Right? Jesus has this teaching, lest a seed falls to the ground and dies, it produces no fruit. That there's my failures in life, my deaths, if you will, tend to lead to new sorts of fruitfulness that I would not have seen coming. And I think that's indicative of my relationship with God, to be honest. He's sovereign enough and I'm faithful enough. That has been true for me. So the academic career died, but I think intellectually it's produced a lot of fruit for me over time. And I travel around now. I speak at way more conferences than I ever did as an academic. I speak at them as a Christian minister and an educator. Same skill set in a way. So it did lead to life, but the heck of a death, man.
Don't you think that also, for someone who tries so many different things, I know you're saying that you can see kind of the positive that has come out of even the failures, but it's also when you look at the sort of breadth of everything that you've attempted, you've had success in one or two very specific ways, right? And you've just tried a lot more things than most people do, which I find when I talk to entrepreneurs and leaders and things, like they feel the failures so acutely, but there are also just more things to fail at because they've just tried so many different things, so many different ways, so many different paths, right?
I'm writing a book on trying. It's called The Life of Try.
Okay.
And if you hang around Bluewater Mission Church, you hear that a lot. Faith means trying.
Okay.
Right? Faith isn't what you believe. Faith is what you do with what you believe. You can believe all the right things and do nothing about it and end up being kind of a bad person.
Right.
But if you try the things that your belief leads you to try, then, well, you see miracles. Creative things happen.
Right.
Positive things happen. And one of the things I've discovered over the decades is that success does not teach you how to try. Trying is the only way to get successful. but success does not teach you trying. Trying teaches you trying.
Regardless of the outcome.
Right. And so the way to be a great trier in life, the way to be really good at trying what you ought, is to try a lot of stuff, to try a lot of different things, or to try again. I think the most important word in the English language is try. The most important phrase is try again. That's where all the faith is, man. And sometimes people who get successful right out of the blocks end up being very damaged, very damaging people because they've never learned how to try honestly, well, right? They will only do what leads to success rather than trying what they ought, you know? They get handcuffed, they get narrow, and they're just boring people. Boring. It's me being critical again, but I would put a lot of politicians in this group, right? They're like, they can only do what is popular and successful.
Right.
They never learn how to try. They have zero faith. That's a disease that afflicts that profession. I'm not judging every single person in politics, but it's a disease that is common to that profession.
They also probably owe so many different people so many different things.
Yeah,
that sort of prisoners.
There's certainly other factors. In business, you find people that are successful, but they're not really good triers. And so they cease to be generative. And in academia, you find a lot of people who are only going to do what's successful. I imagine in the arts and in film and in theater and acting, like, you tout experimentalism. Like, if there's anything that should be experimental, it's art. But have you noticed how, like, all the experimental theater seems kind of samey? You know?
Well, certainly in Hollywood right now, there's no experimentation.
There's none.
It's
no honest trying.
No.
Right?
But it's what you're talking about, right? It's what is the guarantee for X number of viewers, right? Can we just recycle, remake? There's no try there.
There's no try.
There's no. It's how can we have the least risk possible? And that's interesting to think about from an acting perspective, right? You see actors who make it big.
Yeah.
It takes a mammoth undertaking to reinvent themselves as they age. Whether they get big at 14 or 22 or whatever young success they have, once they sort of age out of that role or that type, most of them disappear and often become very unhealthy, right? But it's to sort of reinvent yourself in that way, it's a lot of try because there's a huge likelihood that you'll fail, right? In that, there's a lot of try there.
Yeah. And so I've learned at least that failure is not the worst thing.
Right.
And it's interesting to me that one of the very first lessons that Jesus taught his disciples in the Gospels was how to fail. He sent them out without him for the first time, and early in the Gospel of Mark chapter 6. And he says, go out, preach that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, do a bunch of miracles, don't take any money or clothes or food. People will feed you if you pull off the miracles. If you don't, you'll die. That was the term. And then he said to them, and if they don't accept you in the village, shake the dust off your feet and go to the next village. Shaking the dust off your feet was like slamming the door behind you. He taught his people of faith how to handle failure with panache, with a little style, with a little attitude. And that's a big part of trying, right? It's a big part of the life of faith. You have to get really good at metabolizing failure.
Right.
And I've had a lot of occasion to practice metabolizing failure. There's never been a time in my life where I haven't been wrestling with some epic failure. Occasionally, simultaneously, I get to manage some good success.
Right. Right.
But always failure. That's when the one huge constant, and more than anything else, that's made me who I am, to be honest.
Well, I mean, this church, Bluewater Mission, has been around for how long now?
About 15 years now.
So that's got to count as one of your successes, one of your great tries, right?
It's a try.
And it's been around for 15 years. I mean, it's,
started by accident and still plugging along. So
how did you start?
Well, I worked at another church for a while. I told the story about how I got invited to Hawaii and decided to take it, and worked at a church, another church for 3 or 4 years. And that church did not have a lot of young adults when I showed up, so I gathered some in. And then that church moved across the island, and I had all these young adults who had been kind of gathered and raised up in a certain sort of faith life. And a lot of them couldn't move cross island. And so we just decided to try to plant a new ministry.
Okay.
We didn't know if anybody would show up to the first meeting. We didn't have a place to meet. We didn't have any money. So me and I guess it was about 30 people started the church about 15 years ago. Just decided to minister as we felt the Lord led. You know, we immediately got into some justice stuff, anti-human trafficking efforts in Honolulu. We became quite known for that right off the bat. And I have some epic stories about that, and rescuing women and girls from trafficking. And,
like women on the street who are being trafficked?
Women on the street, or women that are sprung from the brothels in town, and the massage parlors and stuff like that. They exist even here in Honolulu. And then we got involved in it internationally. I felt led to write a book at that time called Miracle Work, and that book did fairly well, and that characterized our ministry. And so we're invited to different places around the world now to go speak about such things. That's how it got started. It was just people trying the ministry things they felt led to try, having no idea if any of it would work.
Well, I mean, it sounds very successful. I mean, you just listed off books and these ministries that have gone. What's been hardest about, this try? This is I mean, a church is a form of it. It's a nonprofit enterprise, right? What's been hard about actually doing it, actually running it? Because we can all list off these things that have gone well, or there's been, but what's hard over the last 15 years about doing it?
So if you're outside this world.
By this world, you mean the ministry world?
Yeah, the ministry world, and in particular, the independent church ministry world. In America, in a lot of places in the West, when we think of churches, we think of church movements and denomination and establishing churches and stuff like that. I do living room churches, right? A bunch of people start gathering in my living room to experience the presence of God, and then it grows, and then gradually you become a church and you figure out what to call yourself. That's a completely independent growth on an age-old tradition, right? There's an age-old tradition in orthodoxy and Christianity, but in a way, we only came from an idea, right? Completely independent. And unlike a business, like you don't market, you don't invest, you don't garner resources, you don't get a loan. You can't do that in the church world. Right. All you can do is take care of people and empower people and see if a community develops. And people, you don't charge for a church. People give you money if they want to.
Right.
And these days, it's very, very unfashionable to ask for money, because there's been so much abuse. And there hasn't actually been much abuse. There's been astonishing little financial abuse in the church world, but there have been some highly publicized abuses.
Right. It's like anything else. The negative stories are the ones that.
Yeah. There are stats on this, and churches do fantastically well, better than other nonprofits. But it is the most entrepreneurial of entrepreneurial ventures, because all you're doing is creating a culture out of nothing, a culture that's based on faith, trying. Right? Not security. Right? There is no input-output equation. There's just, and for a person to jump in and join you and commit their life to something like that, we have people who have committed their lives to it. You don't find another nonprofit. So it's like a nonprofit business, but it is more so. But there are measurables, right? To hit, and how are those different from a normal business, right? Like the success of a normal business is dependent on profit, right? Yeah.
How is that different in the church? What are you measuring?
Well, the way we measure success is by empowered individuals. How many powerful people are we creating?
And what constitutes a powerful person?
Are they trying the things of belief they should try? Are they living as Jesus lived? Are they living lovingly? Are they living miraculously? Are they living generously? Are they making a difference? The first thing Jesus said to the crowd was, you're supposed to be salt and light. You need to make a difference in the world. With what? We have nothing. We're poor.
Right.
We're sick. We're ostracized. And Jesus would say, well, exactly. Do something that's loving and impossible.
Right.
And it's hard to quantify that unless you're in a community looking around. And then you can look at a person and say, oh, well, their life is changing.
So is that something that you feel like you and the staff have to hold everyone accountable to? Or do you feel like, because you said everybody's looking around, is everyone holding everyone else accountable to that life?
Well, the interesting challenge is to build a culture in our church such that people are holding people accountable, and the culture is holding you accountable. One thing that we say around Bluewater all the time is, culture is the best coach. Rules are not the best coach, and even one-on-one relationships are not the best coaching. The best coach you'll ever have is the culture in which you exist. And a church should have a profound culture of trying and a profound culture of grace.
So it's like a team.
Yeah.
Right? It's like players hold each other accountable, the coaches.
They should, right?
Yeah.
In a healthy team,
Yeah.
You have incredible culture.
Right.
And in an unhealthy team, then either that team is going to fail or there'll be one extraordinary individual at the heart of it holding it together for a while.
Right. These are things that I've always thought about and never really delved too deep into. I went to a Lutheran high school, I went to a Lutheran church, so in some ways I came up in the church, and so for me it's interesting also to think about the goal of a church. I think in our society we tend to look at it like a business, right? We're trying to scale, right? But you come from a different place. You come from living rooms, small groups, where you're able to sort of track the development of each individual, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Is there a point at which in churches there's sort of like diminishing returns?
To
right?
scale.
To scale.
Yeah.
The number of people in the church.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting sociological question to do with Christianity itself. Because Christianity started with an absolute nothing of a small group in Palestine in the first century AD, right? It's like an unemployed carpenter and a bunch of fishermen, like largely uneducated, illiterate people. Like there is no reason whatsoever that this movement should have worked.
Right.
And then for centuries and centuries, it has been carried forward almost entirely by faceless, anonymous people doing small things across large areas of the world. Now we have these Christian heroes, these historical figures. I've studied this a lot. If you get right down to it and look at their effect on the movement, it tends to be minimal. The thing about Christianity is that you can't really say why it worked. It shouldn't. It shouldn't, but it just keeps popping up everywhere.
Isn't there a historical theory that says there's like a leader or it's not the strong man theory, but there's a theory where it's one or two powerful people that sort of progress humanity through history, as opposed to the masses, right? Or small, insignificant people that aren't in our history books.
Sure, yeah, the great man.
The great man theory.
Yeah, yeah.
So that was the simplest term possible.
Yeah. It simply does not apply
to Christianity.
If it did, you could have defeated Christianity by just killing off the great man, right? And I guess the first great man, you would say Jesus. Well, when Jesus died, anybody looking at the situation would have called him a failure. Right? His people had abandoned him, like it didn't go very well. Like overnight, the whole thing collapsed. And yet.
Right.
And then 11 out of 12 of the original apostles died violently. They were stopped in their tracks, right?
So they sort of became the great men, and then they got all killed.
Sort of, although you've been evidently following Christ since you were in high school at least, and I bet you couldn't name the 12 apostles.
Yeah, that would be hard.
And yet, you could also argue that they shaped the globe, but the way they shaped the globe was more like, this is a terrible analogy, but it's more like sort of imparting a virus or a contagion. Now you carry it forward, now you carry it forward, and they would give it away to all of these small people.
Right.
And then Christianity does something throughout history that no other movement in history has ever done. And it's this thing called revival. Americans kind of have an idea of like, oh, revival, tent meetings is where everybody gets faith all of a sudden. Sure. And it happens often enough that we have a few traditional ideas about how these things work, although there's a great variety of revivals and very few people actually have the accurate idea of how they work. But what has happened over the course of the last 2,000 years is that every once in a while, for reasons that nobody can explain, in certain parts of the world, faith just kind of breaks out. Like these sub-movements of restoration and revival come from nowhere. Why? Well, because they come from anonymous people, for one thing. They come from living rooms. And who organizes that? Well, no great man, I can tell you that. And then these revivals bubble up as social movements, and they refresh the movement, maintaining the orthodoxy, like the original belief set and passions that started it off. There is no other social movement in the world. There's no other religious movement that has ever had that phenomenon. It's not great man thinking. It's no man thinking.
And you feel like the revivals themselves are sort of responsible for keeping Christianity relevant. Because it's interesting to me that we don't really, in secular conversations and in the world, we don't hear about these things.
No, well, again, I think that starts with academia. They get censored out. Secular religion disallows you to talk of it. But there's so much about the Christian movement that is just fascinating. You could be the rankest atheist in the world, and you should be fascinated by how this has worked. I don't know if I'd say that revivals are responsible for the spreading of Christianity around the globe, but they've certainly played a role. They're either impulses, like they're responsible for refreshing the movement, or they're symptoms of the movement being refreshed by other means. I'm not really sure.
But they're unique.
But they are unique. They're completely unique and not uncommon. And so it says something about the movement itself, or, if you will allow me the faith, it says something about how God moves with people. He's not really wedded to the great man theory. And Jesus said, in the kingdom of heaven, the least shall be first, and the first shall be least. That actually, the most influential people are not the people you would expect.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's how he started the movement, by saying, like, oh no, this isn't going to be fancy and highfalutin.
Right.
Like, this isn't going to be led by a great political leader or a military leader or even a great thought leader. We tend to remember great thought leaders just because we know their names.
Right.
But no, it's been led anonymously, well, I would say by God himself.
So that's the hardest part of running this as a business,
well,
right?
Then,
is that
how do you run a church as an institution, and I think ultimately the most fruitful way to run a church is to run it such that the significant things happen in small ways, right? I don't want to be a great man. I don't want to have great marketing.
So are you pushing the church to enter another revival, or does that just happen?
Yeah, I don't really know how to start a revival. If I did,
That'd be every weekend.
I'd spend a lot of time on it. I think that'd be fairly important.
Right.
But what I try to do is I don't necessarily try to make great people. I try to make really good triers. One at a time, two at a time, 12 at a time.
Right.
Jesus topped out at that. And then they pass it on, and they pass it on, and they pass it on. And you lose control of that, right? You can try to keep control of it and create these sort of monolithic churches and grand pulpits and stuff like that.
And that's what we were talking about, right?
Yeah.
At what point have you seen that those diminishing returns hit, right?
I think there are people who are capable of creating great single churches or great single ministries, but what they do will not last over time. When they die, it will die, more or less.
Why?
The movement, right? The way that Christianity navigates the globe is not based on such things. And so that might be the most fruitful way for you to do it as a great speaker, great leader, great coach or something. But ultimately, you're going to be a sideshow in the kingdom of heaven on earth.
Because once you become a great man, right?
Yeah.
Then you're easily corruptible. It's just you can't carry it on.
Well, there's certainly that, right?
Why can't it last? Why if I build a 10,000 member church, not picking on mega churches, but is it also just because people are so disconnected and the culture can't remain integral? Because you referenced the culture before, right? Well, I just think it's a really interesting...
Yeah, there are probably 6 or 7 really major ways to answer that question. But one is that if you are the man in the grand pulpit, so to speak, very few people in your congregation can emulate you. And what happens is that because you're a celebrity, that people glorify the things that make you a celebrity rather than glorifying the things that make them good people. And we see that in our culture to an incredible degree, right? We'll glorify any celebrity, no matter how reprehensible an individual they are, because fame is its own virtue, and Christianity is the antithesis of that. It's like, no, virtue is virtue. And if you are overlooked, all the better. Right? And then you can spread more easily because most people are anonymous people. And what we're doing in Christian ministry is we're spreading a basic goodness. We're spreading a restoration of what makes us human, not a restoration of what makes us great humans.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And so there's a diminishing return of scale. I think scale is just neither here nor there. Ultimately, you want to be fruitful, and that might not scale large. It might scale small, but infinite.
Right.
And that's been the history of the movement of the faith on planet Earth. And so I try to be honest and contribute accordingly.
Right.
Which, doesn't mean that I won't stand in large pulpits every once in a while. I go speak and try to cause trouble in this city or that.
Sure.
But basically you're trying to create powerful individuals in the community.
Yeah.
And you're trying to get everybody to jump in and participate. The Apostle Paul described it as parts of a body, right? Even the ones that you would be tempted to overlook have really integral functions in the body, right? If your thumb got cut off, even though you don't think about your thumb every day. And Paul says that everybody needs to bring game. Everybody needs to perform according to whatever gift they have. Otherwise, the body doesn't work correctly. It's a very organic analogy, which sounds interesting today, but when Paul used it in the first century, there's nothing else had ever been said like it.
Right.
He's a really original thinker coming up with these analogies.
So,
because it was a very classist society back then in almost every culture, right? And Christianity was the first classless movement in world history.
So that's another part of even the modern version of a church then, is just when you talk about people holding each other accountable based on that culture, it's a culture of everyone being equal.
Yeah. And people forget how revolutionary that was. And people hated Christians for that. They hated Christians for it. Christianity was the world's original women's lib movement. And people hated Christians for the way that they let women have freedom in their midst.
There are women that are a big part of the gospel story.
Huge.
As written 2,000 years ago.
In fact, the women are portrayed far more flatteringly in the Gospels than the men are, as a rule. The men ended up having a lot of social influence, but that had to do with the culture in which they operated,
Right.
the larger culture. Yeah, and Paul from time to time had to advise the first century Christian churches like, hey man, don't make too big a deal of women's freedom because people are going to think that's all we are, essentially.
Right,
that was his advice. But Paul said famously, now there is no slave nor free, no Jew nor Gentile, no man nor woman. In other words, in God, we can all be equal.
Right.
It's like, no one had ever said that before. And it kind of get up on my high horse. It really bothers me when people portray Christianity as an element of oppression in the world. It's like, you got no idea. Read some actual history.
Right.
What Christianity did to revolutionize humanity is without parallel.
Throughout this process, last 15 years of running the church, is there anything that you went into it believing that was different, that's harder than you thought it was going to be, right? That you just thought like, oh, this is what it's going to be like to run a church.
Yeah.
It wasn't that way at all.
So this is maybe like the fourth church I've started from scratch, personally. What's new for me with Bluewater Mission is that I have stuck around for the long term. What I had done in the past is I charted a church, maybe I'd stay there for 2 or 3 years, sort of built it up and then passed it to other people to carry it forward. Or a team, typically it was. Part of the team and passed it to a team to carry it forward. So this one I've stuck around more, and I've gone through life cycles of the church, and I find that to be very difficult. The senior kahu on the island, the senior ministers, all say the same thing about Bluewater. It is the most socioeconomically, racially diverse church they know on the island. And that's happy, that's good. We never talk about diversity.
Right.
We just talk about Jesus and do faith and then look around, and it ends up that kind of draws a diverse crowd.
Why do you think that happens?
I think it's just the nature of the faith, the nature of the movement. I mean, it is by nature, as we said earlier, really inclusive, really classless, and it's about empowering people where they're at as individuals rather than filtering for class or catering to status or anything like that. And so if you do it well and vibrantly, I think almost always, if you have any diversity in the culture around you, you're going to see diversity in churches to the degree
If you're doing it honestly.
Yeah, honestly, that's
because there's other churches that aren't as diverse.
If you're doing it honestly and intensely, a lot of churches are, healthy, but they kind of do their thing. They do the thing that works or what works for their senior leadership. I'm constantly doing stuff that I don't even like to do because I'm constantly thinking of the larger movement and legacy, and I'm thinking about empowering individuals rather than building any single church,
So what's culturally comfortable for some church leadership draws a certain segment of the culture around them, right?
Yeah, it draws people like them.
Right.
Whereas we draw just people. So a lot of people are not like me at Bluewater, and I get teased about that a lot. And it's very good natured. I'm an awkward personality, super introverted, quirky, and my background is strange. My academic and professional background, I'm not standard pastor material.
Sure.
And all of that's good fun.
Right.
And I think it ends up opening the culture in a good way. But it is hard to lead a group of people like that. About half the population on Oahu, our island, is from Oahu. The rest of it is off island. We're actually the least local state in the Union.
Is that true?
That's true.
Huh.
And so we draw about half of our people from transplanted mainland populations. We skew a little young. We tend to draw younger, energetic people, although it's become less true over the years. And there's a lot of instability among young transplanted singles and families.
Right.
And so our church congregation has undergone a lot of population turnover.
Just turnover.
At any given time, like right now, I think we have something like roughly 750 people on our rolls at a church. But our attendance is not that.
Right.
It's half that on occasion. Because people are always coming for 2 years and leaving, coming for 2 years and leaving. And sometimes they're planting their ministries elsewhere, which is cool. But there's a constant reinvention.
Right.
If you were talking about it in business terms, it's like, it is rare to get long-term support. You get long-term clients in that a lot of people in the mainland still call me when they're in crisis.
Right.
But they're not participating in the community locally and helping us do what we do and stuff like that. And so we're always acculturating newbies, right? And that's part of the fun,
Right.
because you get to see people turn on to faith or turn on to the Blue Water culture in a way that changes their lives.
But it's probably hard too.
But it's intense and it's challenging,
Right.
and it's tiring. Right. And then over time, as I get older, I'd like to be in a place where I can just relax a little bit and not have such a people-intensive life.
Right.
I'm comfortable sitting in a library, thinking and writing,
Right.
or, alone on a boat somewhere.
Right.
My
right.
happy place. But that's not this career.
But that's got to be that's such a contrast. You're standing up here preaching to hundreds of people every week, right? And we're having this conversation, and it's being a pastor is a life of relationship and being in front of and with other people, right?
Yeah.
How do you reconcile that on a day-to-day basis? Because there's other people who are business owners who are introverts. There's other leaders who are, right? And everybody has their own way of getting kind of rested up.
Yeah.
What's your strategy?
So what doesn't work for me is that I don't get to craft my job to serve my personality. So that's the downside. I have to craft my job to serve all their personalities.
Right.
Because, I'm in the people changing business. I need to be people intensive. One privilege I have that does work is that when I talk to the crowds of people, or when I have individual conversations, typically I'm talking about stuff that is significant to me. I could talk about Christian history all day long.
Right.
I could talk about you all day long. The caveat being, I really want to talk about you.
Right.
And not like the stuff about you that doesn't mean anything.
Right.
And so I can have significant conversations, and I find that life-giving because tautologically it's significant.
So as long as you're talking about things that matter, not small talk, then that's life-giving for you.
I still get tired, but because I think it counts for a lot, I can go quite some distance. And so that bit is helpful. Right. That bit is helpful. I don't get bored with my job because my job changes all the time.
Right.
You asked me what's been hard about pastoring this church for 15 years.
Yeah.
The other thing that I did not anticipate when we started is the great culture shifts that we have seen in America. Like, America sees the church differently than it did 15 years ago. There's an incredible move of secularism in our country. The social media has been just an incredible force against our young people, but some of our older people as well. The way people get information and get convinced of things has changed a lot. Ideas get talked about in a way that's different. I feel like I'm in a different world than I felt when we started Bluewater 15 years ago. And the way I talk, the way I preach, the way people are when they walk through the door is different. And then, these years of COVID shutdown, I think, have just been way more devastating than the headlines lead you to believe.
What happened? Because I feel like that. I feel like this last year for me was way harder than COVID itself.
Yeah.
Right? And there's some practical reasons for that, but just I feel it here, I feel it's just harder to be hopeful than it was before COVID and after COVID.
We were controlled in a lot of ways, and we were beaten down by fear as a matter of course. We were told that it was virtuous to be afraid. It's not healthy. I go back to that positive psychology movement that we talked about.
Right.
Fear versus faith. Faithful people are healthy. Right. Fearful people are neurotic. It leads to terrible, terrible places.
So you think that's what's happening right now? Is we're all consumed by fear. We're used to being afraid. It's almost a virtue at this point.
We don't even know what it did to us. It disrupted our relationships. It disrupted our version of the future. It disrupted our relationship with government. There are people that got, I got all these strong words. I want to use polite words, but they're completely wrecked by petty tyrants in positions of some power, and they're not even allowed to talk about it.
Right.
And so they're just, you turn that inward and you get depressed.
Right.
You get hollow. People are staggering about. Families look different. Jobs look different. Everything is different. And there are no thought leaders. There are no there are no university leaders, right? No political leaders really talking about it comprehensively and honestly. You just got traumatized, not by the virus, but by all the stuff that we did to supposedly manage the virus.
Well, and for me, I don't want to just adopt the opinion of the other side that's saying, if politically we're so divided right now and one side seems to be saying vaccine bad, the way we handled it bad, and the other side is saying, why didn't more people take it more seriously?
Yeah.
I'm not into just jumping to one side because I feel a little weird,
No.
But there's something weird.
Something weird
About the way I feel like this last year or so, just even from just a mental health perspective, I just don't, you said it, I don't feel like I'm experiencing the world the same way as I was before.
It's a great time, again, to take our conversation full circle.
Yeah.
It's a great time for people of truth to arise,
Sure.
people who are just really good at sussing out reality, right? Honest thinkers and honest analysts. It breaks my heart that we don't produce those people very well, and that to the degree that they exist, we tend to ostracize them. And one of the things I love so much about my faith movement, is that, Jesus said, the truth sets you free. It's like, above all, a Christian is called to be dedicated to reality. If that reality is inconvenient, well, blessed are the meek, Jesus famously said. Confess your sins one to another. Admit your mistakes and get over it, right? And he pioneered that sort of lowly, reality-based lifestyle. It's healthy.
Right.
It's healthy, and we should all be free to pursue it openly. And we need it now more than ever. We need it more than ever because we've just made generations of traumatized, sick people. They need actual leadership and sage wisdom.
So what do you feel like in looking back at everything you've done through academia, but also, we didn't really talk too much about your childhood and your parents and the way you were raised, but I'm always curious about what people feel like they took from their youth and how they were raised and how that applies to what they do for a career now, because so few of us do what our parents did.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But what do you feel like you've taken that you apply on a day-to-day basis from who your parents were?
Yeah. Well, an interesting question for me is just identifying all the different parental influences that I had or did not have.
Sure.
My parents were hippies. Well, they were countercultural figures off of the Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco during the late 60s. They were those people. And their marriage lasted roughly 2 weeks after my birth.
Okay.
And then they needed to clean up their act if they had a baby. My dad made a choice to clean up his act. And my mother walked out of the house and didn't come back. She went back to the party scene. And then some years later, she challenged for custody, and I was awarded to my mom, although I did not know her, because that was just the way the courts did things back then.
Okay.
And so my dad kidnapped me, quote unquote kidnapped me, because the court had taken me away from him, even though he had raised me up to then.
The court had said, mom gets child,
Yeah.
That's the way things go.
Even though he had been alone with me for 3 years. At that point, I was 3. So my childhood was spent running around the country, hiding from the cops, living under assumed names, living on the margins, living in poverty. My dad just kind of finding part-time work where he could most of the time. He was wanted for kidnapping me, ostensibly. But to do that, he also had to dodge the Vietnam draft, so he was wanted for that. So we were kind of in a messy situation.
Wanted for multiple.
So my life was very, very unstable.
Yeah.
And super stressful. Eventually my dad, the legal stuff got sorted out fairly well, and my dad remarried my stepmom from Hawaii. The story is, I don't know if this is the whole story, but the official story is that our financial situation was so bad, though, that the family couldn't afford me and her 2 kids. So I got shuffled out of the house and had to go live with a different relative by myself, my relative being my grandmother, who was a great figure in our church for a while.
Right.
She lived to be almost 100. She was with us. So I stayed with her through most of my childhood. There were no believers, no church-going believers in my family, but I was introduced to Christ by some babysitters I had along the way during that super tumultuous time. But the way I was raised, like I had this budding faith, but I didn't get a lot of church, because I was here and there, moving around all the time, never in one place very long, no stable influences.
Right.
Here's what all of that nonsense gave me, ultimately.
Yeah.
And I think it's also something that my dad consciously tried to inculcate in me, just because he never stopped being the counterculture,
Right.
individualistic guy that he was at the beginning. He got beat up by life in a lot of ways, and he himself had a tough childhood. But him and all the influences, there was never a moment in my life where I did not have to find my own way.
You had to do it yourself.
In every sense.
There's a lack of stability, which means that there's a lack of support, from the people around you.
For the largest chunk of my childhood, I did not even know what my name was.
Your last name.
Right?
Your whole.
Well, either, to be honest with you.
Really?
Or I didn't even, because I was always living under aliases, and when you're really small, it's easy just to let the kid believe in an alias. And so and you learn not to question things like that, which ultimately turned me into someone who questioned everything. And so I just kind of became this, this solo navigator. The upshot for me is I think lots of trauma. I got very quirky, very messed up kid, super depressed, super suicidal. But I developed the ability to, to discern between light and dark, right? I knew what a lie felt like, and I knew what a truth felt like, and somewhere, I think probably because of this faith that I ran into in life, I decided to try, for the truth, and I just found something beautiful in Jesus, and felt like he had something to say to a guy like me.
Do you feel like, because it sounds like really the only stable thing in your childhood, other than some babysitters nearby, or or your faith in Jesus itself was your dad in a lot of ways. Now maybe there was some hit or miss points, but it sounded like he was at least a pillar for you.
In the early going, I mean, but there were some years in which I was the kid who had to go, right? I mean, he sort of let me go. Like first he fought for me,
Right.
and when we got remarried, he let me go. So super influential, but in the same token, although my dad and I were always close, it was hard for me to trust that relationship because for a big part of my formative years, he just wasn't present.
Right.
My advantage was that at any given time in my life, although the circumstances were often messy, there was always someone who loved me.
Right.
Right? It was a different person at a different time, but there was someone nearby who I felt like I could trust, and that was very, very salvific.
So do you feel like that your ability to kind of walk through these very unstable environments helped you with the type of church that you have now, right? Where you have a lot of turnover, a lot of different kinds of people, but they each need just a little bit of support, just a little bit of, right? A little bit of something to bring them in and make them feel like they belong.
Yeah, I don't always have the answer for the person who's sitting across from me, but I've developed a knack for finding the individual in the person standing or sitting across from me. It's like, look, this is what you need to find your way. And a lot of that, again, I learned from Jesus.
Right.
He was a great question asker. Like he very, very rarely gave easy answers. He almost always responded to a question with a question. He was always trying to get the person out of the person, and trying to get people to discover the real them, and getting them to a higher level of freedom and empowerment. And to me, that's ministry. And I recognize the value of it in my own life, of course, early on. It's like, I think I'm supposed to be more than I am. I think I'm supposed to be other than my circumstances.
That's interesting.
I think the world is supposed to be other than the world is.
Right.
And you get, kids who come through stuff like that, they all have great BS detectors. And I have a great BS detector.
Right.
And it was just up to me to sort of educate myself for the other side of it so that I got a good truth detector as well. What is trustworthy? And I think a lot of humans get stuck because they can detect the BS, but they never learn to trust the truth.
Right.
And I'm just trying to do the second half for people most of the time.
So what now? You're getting up there in age. No, you're still pretty young.
Getting gray.
You're still a pretty young guy, but how does it all end? I mean, we don't all get to stick around. None of us get to stick around forever. But what does the end look like for you from a success standpoint? Like, what if you've done it well, right? At the end, what does that look like?
I had these series of dreams when I was a sophomore in college. They lasted for 6 weeks every night. And in these dreams every night, I would run from people who were trying to kill me for preaching the gospel. And then invariably they'd catch me. I remember the first night I had the dream, a guy caught me, tied me up, threw me in a chair with his henchman, and held a pistol to my head and said,
Wow.
You have to stop preaching. You have to stop preaching your truth, or I will kill you. And then it's one of those dreams that seem like they stretch for 3 or 4 hours, although I probably didn't, But that moment lasted forever as I stared down the gun barrel. And what I realized in the dream was like, my preaching hadn't done much. Like I wasn't being followed by great crowds or anything. And so the equation for me was, well, why not stop trying so hard? It's not like I've done any great thing. I could just say sure, and it's not like it would make much difference to the world. And I at least walk away alive. But of course, a person of virtue can't make that choice.
Right.
And so in the dream, I finally decided, go ahead and shoot. And the guy pulled the trigger and killed me. And, Then I woke up, and I had a dream. Every night I would die in some different way, sometimes explosions, drowning.
So you'd always
pushed
make the
off
same decision
And
to
I always
continue.
make the same decision every night, as if I were practicing in my spirit, right, this thing. And sometimes I would die, and my spirit would raise from my body, and like it got really trippy. And it got so that I had a dark humor about it, because like for every night I would have these nightmares.
You knew it was coming.
I knew it was coming. So there's a lot of my life that I think has borne out those dreams. I would say that they were prophetic dreams in their way, in that you have to decide what you will do, even if it doesn't bring you the scale of success that you think it should. You know, what's worth doing? What's worth dying for if you're only dying? You know? And the older I've gotten, the more failures I've had, the more successful failures I've had. We talked about that a little bit. Even the failures can be fruitful. Mm-hmm. The more I've come to the place where I'm not really chasing success. I'm just chasing goodness. You know, I want to be good. I don't necessarily want to be great. And I think over time, that's what changes the world anyway, goodness, not greatness. It's easy to make that mistake. And I think there will come a point in the not too distant future for me in which my moment of death comes. My guess is I'm going to be able to see it coming, as I did in the dream. And I'll kind of be faced with that evaluation. Was it worth it? You know? And if it's worth it, it's not going to be worth it because of great success. It will be worth it because it was true, because it was honest, because it was right, because it was godly. And I think the good things last eternally, and the great things typically last a little while at most. So I think that's what's ahead for me. There's a way in which I think that's what's ahead for all of us. It's not the business that you build. It's not the artwork that you create. It's not the people who follow you. It's not the people who know your name. It might not even be you knowing your name in some of our cases, right? A lot of us spend big chunks of our life chasing such things. But probably in the final moments, we'll just be thinking like, well, were we truly good? Were we good and true?
Right.
I think that's what's ahead for us. And I have reason to believe, some of them due to my spiritual tradition, and some of them due to other traditions and other studies. I have reason to believe that this life is not all there is, that there's something beyond this particular expression of existence. I think we transcend. I think we evolve in ways that none of us understand. I'm so fascinated by all the cosmological physics, the studies being done in the origins of the universe. We know more scientifically than we've ever known, and one of the things we know is that there's way more that we don't know.
Sure.
Right? The smarter we get, the more we realize how ignorant we are about how this universe works and how time works and dimensions and things like that. One of my hobbies is physics and geekdom. I love all of this stuff. I don't think that this is all there is. The interesting thing is, well, what's the best passage from here to there? And what you're going to get is clues. And then you have to figure out whether you're going to try or not. And I think that's life.
The end is the beginning, in some ways.
It's true.
Awesome. Well, thanks for this time. Appreciate it.
Nice to hang out.
Yeah, it was a good...
You should, shave.
I thought about it, but, I just wanted to have the degree of
I
contrast.
wore a collared shirt.
Nah, no. That's even less likely than the shaving. All right, until next time.
Take it easy, man.
We'll do this again.